Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight at the 2021 Virtual Fairfax County Public Schools Mental Health and Wellness Conference and Inova Act on Addiction Summit. This webinar series would not be possible without the generous support of the HIT family, the Fairfax Falls Church Community Services Board, Kaiser Permanente, and Innovation Health. Before I introduce our speaker, here are a few housekeeping notes. All participants' lines have been muted and everyone's video has been turned off. We will be taking questions via the Q&A feature, and they can be submitted at any time during the presentation. We will do our best to get to as many questions as we can. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Stacey Hardy-Chandler, and I'm so thrilled to have her here tonight. Take it away, Dr. Hardy-Chandler.
Thank you, Bethany. I am very excited to be here tonight, and we're going to get started. I do want to start from a place of gratitude in thanking you for inviting me, and certainly thanking the Fairfax County Public Schools and Inova Health, and certainly thanking all of the people who took the time to join us tonight. There are a ton of other things that you could be doing, so I really appreciate you making this investment really in yourselves. So I want to talk a little bit about the title of this workshop, Getting a Handle on. If you Google that, Google tries to predict what you're going to say based on what other people have searched. So if you type in get a handle on, a lot of things are going to come up. And in our case, we're talking about getting a handle on something in terms of coping. So if you Google that, a lot of other things come up. Any one of these can be their own workshop. So for tonight, in our very short time together, I thought we'd dig deeper and look at some foundational kinds of things that might set us on the path of getting a handle on all of these things. You have to do it with a gesture, getting a handle on all this. So it's not going to solve everything, but we're going to have some concrete things that you can do immediately. Before we get into the meat of it, though, I want to introduce myself. This is me. And I want to share a little bit about my journey from baby Stacey to Dr. Stacey. My background is in social work, clinical psychology, and law. But if you ask me about my professional identity, I am a social worker. I don't do social work. Social work is a part of who I am. I say if you cut me, social work juice is going to come out. It's a very important part of why I feel I am here in this life with a capital H, and that matters when we are talking about coping. I've been very fortunate to have a career that's lasted over 3 decades, working with a wide variety of people over the course of the entire lifespan, from young children to older adults. And I want to honor all of the clients, the colleagues, the students that I've worked with over the course of my career, because if you get anything out of tonight, it will be because they have crossed my path as a professional. So I want to honor their contribution to us being here tonight. And I also believe in serving in other ways. So there are volunteer kinds of things that I do to serve my profession and my community. In addition to doing direct practice and management, I've also had an academic career. Some of this stuff overlapped, and served on faculties on both sides of the country at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, my adopted home, Viva Las Vegas, as well as George Mason. And I currently serve as the director of the Center for Children and Families for the City of Alexandria, as well as having my own consultancy practice, and that's what brings me here today. Just a little bit of my journey. Okay, this slide, believe it or not, is our full agenda. This is everything we're going to cover tonight. Very clear, very simple. We're going to cover the head. We're going to cover the heart. And we're going to cover our hands, what we can do about the things that we learn. My goal is that by the end of this time, when we are hitting close to 7 o'clock, you will have 10 tips that you can use immediately, maybe even during this webinar, but certainly immediately afterwards. I'm going to be doing some gestures and things like that. I invite you to join with me. That's how we learn, is that we do things. So I'm going to invite you to make some hand gestures as we go along the way, and it'll make the information stick with you a little bit better. So let's dive right in. I'm going to start with using our heads. Why? Because our heads, our brains, are trying to keep us safe. There's a lot of chaos going on, and the way we think is really in an effort to keep us safe. And Dr. Siegel did a presentation on Tuesday, If you get an opportunity, please Google his short video on the hand model of the brain. And I'm going to just review that very quickly. This will not give you a PhD in neurobiology, but it is a wonderful explanation for how our heads try to actually keep us safe. So what he does is he talks about the brain stem as being represented by your palm. If you hold up your hand like this, do it with me. And that is related to our basic living functions, and it also helps us detect threat out in the world. The next part is the limbic system, which is represented by the thumb. And this represents emotion, why things have meaning for us, and everything connected to that. The amygdala is located there. And you can see how emotion is very close to threat, right? And then finally, there is the cortex, and this relates to how we engage in logical thought, how we make decisions, how we predict the longer term effects of our behavior. And finally, there's the spinal cord. But basically, our brain tries to keep us safe, tries to detect danger. And when we do, our sympathetic nervous systems kick in, and our cortex may not be in communication with our emotions as closely. So let's talk about what that looks like, really. We've all seen this, right? Temper tantrum. One of the wonderful examples of an amygdala hijacking is when that emotion passes a threshold. There's no logic you can apply. It is pure emotion. And I wish that this was the only place we saw it, but we also see this happening when people flip their lids, right? We see this happening in road rage incidents. And certainly lately, more recently, we've been seeing it on airplanes. And we see it in instances of microaggression where there's a disconnect between that part of our brain that says, this is not a good idea, and the emotions that are flooding into and guiding our immediate behaviors. Look it up. There's also some videos on how to teach kids the hand model of the brain, and kids can actually say, you know, I feel like I'm flipping my lid, and they have that language. This is also used when we do mediation, when there be a tense mediation situation. Teaching the participants the hand model of the brain helps them have a tool for putting that lid back on. So, handy tip number one, pause to get a handle on flipping your lid. Take time to allow the reasoning of the cortex to catch up with the emotion. And let me give you an example. I think most of us may have had like a near miss incident in a car. And if you think back on how that happened, you got scared first before you cognitively knew what was going on. Emotions are fast. And so sometimes when we can take a pause, we allow that better decision-making to catch up with those emotions. Even for those of us who are doing diversity, inclusion, and equity work, you'll find that a lot of equity lenses ask questions. And what do those questions do? They prevent us from simply acting on our implicit bias, the bias that is almost automatic, you know, and isn't challenged. The questions allow us to challenge those default behaviors. So it's almost like, again, allowing good decision-making to catch up with what we do automatically. Now, this one piece, people have actually contacted me later and said, this is a tip that actually saved my friendship or prevented me from doing something that I would have regretted at work. Take 2 minutes before you press send or reply on that text, email, or social media post. We have all gotten that email that is infuriating, and we're going to write them back and tell them and correct them on everything that they're saying that's wrong. One of the good things about working remotely a little bit is what I do is I'll get that email, I'll get up, empty the dishwasher, come back, and I'm able to come back to the email or to the text in a place of curiosity. There's some other questions I need to ask before I respond. So just that one piece is extremely helpful. And why do you need to pause? Why did that old advice about counting to 10 work so well? It allows the cortex, right, the thinking part of our brain, to catch up with the emotional part of our brains. So in a speed race between emotions and thoughts, emotions are faster. Emotions are always going to win. But logic is usually the better driver. So give yourself a chance to allow better driving. Okay. How many people are in this picture? I think if we look at it at a glance, we might see maybe a portrait of a colonel. But if we look a little closer, there's more going on in this picture. We see a couple, but wait, maybe it's a family. Maybe there's a grandfather, a daughter, and a grandchild in her arms. And if you look even closer in the picture, there are portraits up in the corner. It's hard to see right here, but there are at least 3 profiles and 1 frontal view of a face. And there's another profile up in the other corner. Let me just go back and show you the original picture. So there are a lot of people, but we have to look a little deeper. We have to look a little closer. Let me give you another example. Let's use this riddle. A man leaves home on foot one evening, makes 3 left turns, and arrives back home to find 2 masked men waiting there. I grew up in inner city Los Angeles, and this would be scary for me. I have been held up at gunpoint, so masked men doesn't sound like a good thing. But also, what if it's October 31st? And what if these masked men are simply people who are taking their kids trick-or-treating? There may be other things going on, and sometimes we need to just look a little deeper. So in this particular case, I'm not a baseball person. Going left 3 times and returning back home actually reflects a baseball game. And the 2 masked men are the catcher and the umpire. And then now in the time of COVID, right, you can go around the block and see masked people everywhere. So we need more information before we draw conclusions. We're going to bust some assumptions today. That's important because we see the world not as it is, but we see the world as we are. Let's talk a little bit about social and emotional intelligence, because that significantly impacts how we see the world. When we have high social and emotional intelligence, a lot of good things are going on. We can employ good social skills. We can have empathy for other people. We're motivated to meet our goals. We can regulate our emotions, and we have high self-awareness. We know what's going on with ourselves. We're present with ourselves. What does it look like if we have low social and emotional intelligence? Well, let me tell you. If we are not as self-aware as would be helpful, that puts us in a defensive place. We see very normal comments or benign things as threats, as things we need to defend. We're very fragile, right? If we are unable to regulate our emotions, think of the person we might refer to as the drama queen or the drama king or the drama person. That's when the emotions are way out of proportion to the circumstances. You just say hi. Why did you say hi to me? You didn't say hi to me before. Why did you say good morning? Why do you want me to have a good morning? So that kind of thing. And without motivation or drive, we find ourselves stagnant or in a holding pattern. I think here about what I told you earlier about me being a social worker. That's my motivation. That keeps me going late into the night, working on things that I love, that I'm passionate about. And empathy, when we're low on empathy, we have a hard time grasping communication as truly being bi-directional. We think, it's what we want to say to other people or what we want to do, not necessarily taking into consideration how that falls on them or how they hear it. So we have a very difficult time understanding the impact of our actions and our statements on other people. And then if our social skills are low, we have difficulty finding common ground with people. We want to otherize them. We have difficulty recognizing their humanity. Our exchanges with them are transactional rather than real, genuine relational connections. In reality, most of us fall in between here, me too, right? And we're all striving, hopefully, to move toward higher social and emotional intelligence. It has huge implications for allowing us to thrive. It also has incredible implications for things like hiring, making policy decisions, all kinds of interactions. So, handy tip number 2, look in the mirror. Aim for self-awareness. And this is critical. Remember, that was at the top of the high social and emotional intelligence sort of ladder there. So it's really something that we want to aim for. How do we do this? We think we know ourselves, but in reality, there are parts of ourselves that aren't readily available. If we can engage just one honest friend that's going to really tell us the truth, that's helpful. I keep a circle of friends around me. They're not that many, but who will tell me the truth. They will say, in that meeting, Stacey, you needed to dial it back. And I need to hear that. You need to keep that friend who is going to tell you that you have spinach in your teeth. They're not going to say, I'm uncomfortable, I'm not going to tell you. No, they're going to say what you need to hear out of their compassion and their love for you. Keep those friends around. It's easier, to be honest, to have the friends who are going to tell us what we want to hear, who have our same views and will never counter us. Way easier, but it's not how we become more self-aware. The other thing I want to point out, adults, in working with our kids in the schools and all of our the other people in our lives that we touch, self-awareness, self-care, self-examination is one of the best things that you can do for your kids' mental health and well-being. Your example, your modeling this is important. We wouldn't necessarily go and get marathon coaching from someone who is winded climbing a flight of stairs. We wouldn't. My husband has a barber. He looks at the barber's hair right before he selects the barber he's going to. My mother was a horrible photographer. She could not take a picture. We knew her pictures, and this was back in the day with actual cameras. We knew which pictures were hers because they all had people, their heads were cut off from the nose up. This is a woman who I wake up every day grateful that her blood runs through my veins. She didn't have a lot of education, but she was an incredible orator. She would walk into a room and just command this authority. She's the one I went to when I had to make big decisions, but I would not hire her as a photographer. All of the pictures were, or if she were behind the camera now, I would look like this the whole time. But fortunately, when we're talking about mental health and wellness, we don't have to worry about that disconnect. We all can develop that skill by practicing. We don't have to be perfect at it, but our self-awareness allows us to make better decisions, not only for ourselves, but for our children. And that's not selfish. That's actually one of the most generous things that you can do for the people around you. Okay, using our hearts. We've covered 2 tips. Using our hearts, we're going to talk about 3 more tips. And using our hearts is important because we are interdependent. We are connected to one another. One of the things that comes up in these uncertain times is loss. Certainly loss in the traditional sense in terms of losses of people that we care about. But we've also lost a lot in terms of our normal routines, in terms of the things that we used to take for granted, shaking hands, hugging. We've lost a lot. And we need to pay attention to that and lean into it with compassion and empathy. We talked about how empathy is important. Under optimal conditions, there would be a change. We'd adjust to the change. We'd master what we needed to do in a new situation. And then maybe there would be another change. And we'd master that change and adjust. And there might be another change. I wish that's how it worked. In the real world, we have change coming from all directions, all the time, unpredictably. Things are changing and shifting. And one of the things that comes with that, is a recognition that change and loss are 2 sides of the exact same coin. And if we're dealing with not only change, but loss, we're also dealing with grief. So let's talk about that. COVID has taught us that kind of we're all in the same boat. We used to try to think that that problem on the other side of the world, that health problem that's over there, that issue that only affects those people, it affects all of us. We all pay the price for some of these things that are happening. And so we need to be involved in keeping our collective boat afloat. Responses to loss can range from sadness, which we might immediately think of, but it can also look like guilt, fear, anger, disappointment. It can feel like you're going crazy, like this isn't reality, like you're outside of your experience. It can also have physical ramifications. So responses to loss in a physical way can include a lowered immunity system. And I want to skip down to a general sick or tired feeling. Sometimes if somebody chronically kind of says, I just don't feel right, or I just feel tired all the time. It may be something, but it could also be them grieving, them responding to loss and that manifesting in their body. So I think all of the morning shows over the course of COVID have talked about what to look for in terms of mental health concerns. And there's 5,000 lists and a gazillion things. I'm going to teach you the core of what to look for in a way that's memorable and accessible, and you won't have to concern yourself with all of those lists. If you could pay attention to these 4 things, that will be so helpful to you in determining what you're going to do next. So another hand gesture, do it with me. Point north, point south, point east, and point west. So what are we going to look for in our kids in terms of their coping with loss or other challenges? North, we're going to look for a new behavior. Is there something that this kid is doing that is different from how they were before? Was she very outgoing and athletic and now having difficulty getting out of bed every day? If it's a new behavior or major change, we want to know. Note that for sure. South, we talked about sadness, and this looks very different developmentally. So the younger the child, you might not see the typical sadness. You might see something along the lines of agitation or irritability or even aggression. So I used to work with a lot of care providers, sometimes with kids with providers who cared for kids who were in group homes and things like that. And I said, think about the kid who was having the most aggression problems. Just put that person in your mind. And I said, let's look at that differently. List in your head, that person's case. List in your head everything you think that kid has lost. And they realize that this is a pretty long list. Let's reframe this child, this bad kid, in terms of grieving. Maybe that aggression is connected to them going through a grieving process, but not developmentally having the coping skills to navigate those. Super important. Let's go east. East, eating or sleeping, some of those basic things that are a part of life. If there are major changes there, doesn't want to eat his favorite foods, or the sleeping changes, a little kid wanting to sleep with you at night, scared to sleep alone, those kinds of things we want to pay attention to. And west, withdrawal from other people or activities that they previously enjoyed. So if you remember north, south, east, and west, you will remember core things that you want to pay attention to when you're watching your kids' behavior and wanting to support their wellness and well-being. Remember, everything is potentially information, and information can guide our decisions. So, handy tip number 3, we're going to face feelings. Sometimes we get a little nervous, we're a little concerned, but ignoring those feelings, or especially if you have a gut feeling that something just isn't right, that's not perfect, but it's often, I trust people's guts. I trust the guts of people, teachers and parents who just feel like something's not quite right. That's something to pay attention to. Handy tip number 4, family and friends, those connections to others, caring others. And I do have to call out the faith community, because research shows over and over again, when people are connected to a community where there's a value larger than yourself, that supports positive outcomes. And then finally, we can't ignore, if there is complicated grief or significant mental health challenges, reaching out for professional help. And again, we're in a better place to do this when we are paying attention to what we're feeling and what the people around us are manifesting. So we had a couple of tips from the head. Remember, we talked about not flipping our lid. We talked about looking in the mirror and doing that self-awareness. When we talked about heart, we talked about facing feelings. We talked about connecting with those in our social support network, family and friends, and potentially getting professional help if we need to. Now we're going to roll up our sleeves and talk about our hands and what we can do. Okay, so let's go to that part. I'm going to talk about something that I like to call resilience-driven leadership. And that's important because it makes us feel less helpless. This is a time when we can feel very out of control and not feeling like we can have an impact on our circumstances. So as we talk about resilience-driven leadership, we're also talking about being empowered and recapturing our sense of agency. So who knows what this logo is? I think someone said Allstate. I don't know if someone works for Allstate, but that's great. Yes, you are correct. This is Allstate. You're in good hands. And as the story goes, back in the 50s, 1950s, an Allstate general manager had a child who was in the hospital. And of course, his wife was very concerned, very worried. And he tried to comfort her and he said, please don't worry, she's in good hands. And as the story goes, that then became the tagline for the insurance company. There are times when we feel we're in good hands, and there are times when we don't feel like we're in good hands. I think many of us have uttered these statements. Listen, they don't do anything. Why won't leadership solve the problem? I have been here X number of years. It's always the same. But resilience-driven leadership asks the question, what if we are they? What if we are part of the capacity to do something or to make changes? Let me explain what I mean. Every organization, whether it's Fairfax County Public Schools or Inova Health or Northern Virginia government or whatever entity or group you want to identify, these things don't exist in the absence of the individuals who make up that entity. So when we're talking about things being systemic, there are people that are a part of that system. And at some point, I have to ask myself, as one of the individuals, my little brown self, what is my role in making this system better? What is my role in supporting those of my neighbors or my colleagues who are also a part of the system? And it's really the collective. It's us working with our allies. It's coming together that changes these big, massive things that we feel are too big for us to change. So thriving requires a sort of all hands on deck approach, the recognition that maybe Stacey can't do something, but boy, Stacey can pull together a team and maybe we can do something together. So let's get into some resilience-driven leadership principles. Easy stuff. Put your thumb up. And usually when we do a thumbs up, it's because something is good. And we might do a thumbs way up if it's great. So I want you to remember strengths. What are these? Any gardener friends out there? I hope you said tomatoes. And what are these? I hope you said cucumbers. Believe it or not, this is one of my most controversial slides. What I mean by this is we struggle sometimes really honoring people's strengths. We sometimes struggle honoring that a tomato is a tomato. What we do is we try to make those tomatoes into cucumbers. We say that we prioritize cucumbers and that tomato should be a cucumber. Gardener friends, I've talked to them. There's no fertilizer, there's no additional sunlight, there's no watering pattern that is going to change a tomato into a cucumber. So why are we focused on that? Can we focus just for a little bit on helping the tomato be the healthiest, juiciest tomato it can be? This goes well beyond the garden. If you worked with an organization, sometimes we get people and we say, you know, you're too tomato-y for us. So we are going to send you to a tomato training. We are going to get you we're going to send you to a cucumber training. We're going to get you a cucumber coach. We're going to add some cucumber goals to your performance evaluation. And we try to make them fit into something that they aren't, all while talking about how we value diversity. It's a very interesting phenomenon. In reality, and I identify as a social worker, as a change agent, but in reality, people don't change that much, but we can help them grow into their potential. And why is that not okay? Sometimes, even in organizations, it may mean that for this tomato to thrive, we've tried to nurture this tomato into being its full tomato, but maybe we need to actually replant it in another part of the garden where it can really, really thrive and grow into its potential. So let's really genuinely honor diversity, which means recognizing when people actually do have strengths and attending to those. So here's the assumption we're going to burst. People think that we grow by working on our weaknesses. What are your limitations? Okay, let's work on building those. We can grow that way, but actually we grow much more by building on our strengths. I could probably really work hard at becoming a Pittsburgh Steeler, play every day, and I might get a little bit better at football, but I'm not going to be a Pittsburgh Steeler. My time and energy would be better invested in deciding on and identifying what Stacey is good at and nurturing that. And for that kid in the classroom, deciding on or figuring out and tuning into what he or she or they are good at and fostering that. How can we work along with different people's strengths, because we're saying we value diversity. That's the better return on our investment. And we have to be careful. Sometimes we define things as weaknesses when they are strengths. People have done a lot to simply be here. To be here today is, in some cases, for some people, a miracle. There are strengths there. And all of us who are trying to help others of us in our community need to honor those strengths, right? The thumbs up. So tip number 6, be genuinely strengths focused. Honor people's strengths and diversity that might be in different ways than we thought of before, and use those strengths as an opportunity to make decisions that are really not only in their best interest, that are going to help us as well. That means also attending to our own strengths. Okay, do this with me. You know what this means. We're number one. We're number one. Okay, when we think about number one, we think of leaders. Leaders is the first person in the line, the person at the top of the org chart, right? I want to put forth an argument to you tonight that we're all leaders. We all have the capacity to be leaders. So my question to you, and nobody's listening, I mean, just answer these questions. You're not getting graded. Are you a leader? Do you consider yourself a leader in your community or on your work team or in your family? Some people say yes, some people say no, some people say I don't know. So let's explore that. I have a 3-question test about leaders. Think of the person you think of as being the quintessential leader, and think of the quality that they have that makes you think of them as being a leader. What quality stands out to you of a leader? Just think about a word or phrase. In prior offerings, when I've offered this test, these are some of the things that other people came up with. See if yours is on the list. Respectful, good leader, trustworthy. I like that one. Visionary, being able to see into the future, fair, impartial, good problem solver, all of those kinds of things. All wonderful things. The last one is particularly interesting because when I do leadership-oriented trainings with people who have been identified by other people as strong leaders, they always say, foster other leaders. That's what comes out of their mouths as being, quintessential for a leader. So think about those qualities. Think about the one that you said or the one you thought of, and let's move on. One thing that no one ever mentions, and I've been doing this little 3-question quiz for years. What do you think? What do you think is a thing nobody ever mentions? Position. No one ever says, oh, they're a leader because they're a supervisor. They're a leader because they're a director. Position never comes up as a leadership quality. And that's something to definitely note, especially when we go to our second question, which is, Have you ever known someone in a high position, a senior management position, who did not possess the leadership qualities we all just identified? Now, this is the time when I miss doing it live, because when I do this live, people go, there they are over there, or, because people have come with that person sometimes. So I will see the little, that person, which is hilarious. So typically, if you have been in any kind of social situation or work situation, you have known someone who has a position, who has a title of some sort, but does not at all possess those qualities. So that brings us logically to question number 3. Have you ever known someone in a so-called lower position, like interns, maybe youth or people with lived experience, who did possess those leadership qualities? And again, people have no trouble identifying someone who didn't have the highest title, but absolutely manifested leadership qualities. That kid who breaks up the interaction between a bully and another kid is 100% showing some leadership qualities. So this little 3-question test should emphasize the fact that leadership and position are not one and the same. They're not interchangeable. Leadership has to do with impact, right? Social influence on others, which we all have the capacity to do. And so if you have 6 to 7 minutes, there is a TED Talk that I want you to look up later. It's called Everyday Leadership. The presenter is Drew Dudley, and he tells this wonderful story of this tiny little encounter and how it just made him pivot in terms of his understanding of what leadership really is and how we can all embrace it. So busted assumption, and we need to bust another assumption, look a little deeper. Only people at the top of an org chart can help us thrive in uncertain times. That is absolutely not true. People with fancy titles may have positional power. I'm not saying they have no power at all, but don't underestimate persuasive power, which we can all have in terms of how we interact with one another and how we treat one another. This bottom point is also critical. Resilient leaders also know when to follow. So leadership isn't always the loudest person in the room or the person talking the most. Resilient leaders also know when to let other people shine, when to let other people be number one. So handy tip number 7, you can lead from right where you are starting today. I would like to ask one tiny little favor, because this helps in terms of our messaging to people. Right now, if you can, I challenge you to stop using the word leadership interchangeably with senior management. We just proved they're not the same. That then gives us an opportunity to really help other people around us and ourselves embrace the leadership qualities that we have. Because what do? We say, you can be a leader at every level. What are you going to do with that report? I'm going to send it up to leadership, which means it's a very small group of people with certain titles. So our messaging is disjointed. We don't want to do that. That small change can really, over time, kind of impact the culture of your classroom, of your community group. Take an inventory of everybody you encounter, even virtually on a regular day. I know we're separated a lot, but we encounter a lot of people in our interactions with one another, even on Zoom. And then consider each of those encounters a sacred leadership opportunity, because every time you have an opportunity to connect with someone, that's a leadership potential. So when in longer sort of presentations, I ask people to, after looking at the everyday leadership video, identify something that really shifted in terms of someone else showing their leadership in their interaction with them. And it's usually something easy. It's not, oh, I was walking down the street and someone gave me $1 million. It's things like, I was afraid to go out to my car and a coworker escorted me. Or I was kind of struggling with where to go, and someone said, "Hey, you're good with working with people," and that changed the trajectory of my life. Tiny, when people get to these examples, he, in the video, they're referred to as lollipop moments. These are tremendous opportunities to show leadership with a young person, with a parent you're talking to, with an educational professional, even with someone you vehemently disagree with. There's leadership opportunities there. Okay, hold up your hands. I am an HGTV fan to the end. I love House Hunters. I love Love It or Listed. I love you, Good Bones. Everything. I love all the shows on there. And no matter what the show is, if they're looking for a house, if there's going to be a house purchase, what is the thing that keeps coming up? Location, location, location. We can change the color of the paint, but we can't move the house. Where the foundational thing here in resilience-driven leadership is resilience, resilience, resilience. So let's talk about resilience for a moment as quality. In these times with these difficult conversations about inequity, dealing with the pandemic, dealing with climate change, dealing with all of these things in the world, that colors our context. So in this illusion, the question, of course, is which figure appears the smallest? The one in front, the one with the larger door, that one appears the smallest, but you can actually put your finger up to the screen and measure that each of these figures are exactly the same. But what changes why they look bigger or smaller? The context. And right now we're in a context that makes many of us feel so small, but we're not. We have the same capacity that we did before. Our circumstances are challenging, and we need to tap back into who we are and what we bring to our situations. So let's talk about resilience. My family name is literally Hardy. So resilience has been a part of our family story like forever. So even when someone behaved in a sort of, resilient way, or, with a lot of fortitude, we would go, oh, that is so Hardy. That is Hardy right there. So that's kind of a part of, conversations that we have. But what does that mean? It means being able to withstand difficult situations, tap into protective factors. Sometimes we can leverage our resilience so much that we not only bounce back from negative situations, but we can actually be better. We can bounce forward. We could learn something from it that puts us actually in a better place than we were before. And continuing with our gardening theme, hardy plants, got to go there. Let's talk about resilience shields, such as protective factors in particular. Definitely take a look at the developmental assets framework, which outlines 40 things. They're half external, half internal things that when we can surround our kids with these, their likelihood of thriving, coming into their own and being, happy and productive citizens are increased. More developmental assets, better outcomes. And then looking at the Fairfax County website, I found 3 for success, which goes really well with our resilience thing. So if you are familiar with that, that will help you remember, right, those 3 areas. Smooth seas do not make skillful sailors. So we may not be able to change the rough seas, but we can definitely improve how we navigate them and how we come through them safely. I definitely emphasize that where resilience exists, trauma can't thrive. They are mutually exclusive. You cannot be resilient. The more resilient you are, the less impact trauma has on you. So think about it this way. Resilience is like a vaccine, and trauma is like a virus. And all of these things related to the pandemic and, seeing violent acts against one another, these are traumatic experiences that we're experiencing, sometimes individually, but certainly collectively as a society. Our vaccine emotionally to these are the things that we do to fortify our resilience. Being more resilient also helps expand, stretch our window of tolerance for stress, not so that we can take more, so that we can work together, so that we can withstand some of the things that we need to withstand in order to make some changes, in order to help our kids, in order to support our teachers, in order to, buoy our parents and families. So here's a busted assumption. Things are terrible and there's nothing we can do about it. In most cases, it's our response to the things that are more powerful than the event themselves. So let's go back to our driving example. Last time there was a near miss. Let's say this time there's a little fender bender. In this case, people can get out and yell, and that was so stupid. Why did you cut in front of me? Everything is horrible. I mean, I'm going to sue you. That could be one response. But there could be the same fender bender outside, and people get out and say, oh my goodness, are you okay? I see a car seat. Is your kid okay? Let's exchange our, and same situation, different responses. So clearly it isn't the situation that defines us, it's how we respond to it. And that's not to say that those traumas that we're experiencing aren't real. They are real, they're very real, and it's not just a matter of minimizing them. They're extensive. We're seeing that trauma is far more extensive than we thought previously. Individual trauma, historic trauma, all of these things are very real. But how can we inoculate ourselves? That's handy tip number 8. We need to be able to inoculate ourselves to a certain extent. We do that by welcoming failure as feedback. The most resilient people you know don't avoid failure, but they learn from it. And so I personally am not a fan of the phrase failure is not an option. For us as human beings, failure is not only an option, it's inevitable. And some of us, me, fail every day at things. But the idea is that we use that feedback so that we're fostering alignment between our values and our actions by actually learning, by actually gaining something from that, by actually using those failures to help others. The reason why we need to inoculate ourselves against all of this toxic stress is that we need each other. We need to work together so we can fight the real enemies. When we're not inoculated, meaning working on our resilience, we can find enemies in certain groups, or we can find them in certain ways of scapegoating. It's easier, it's a little hanging fruit, but we need to come together to fight these gigantic things like racism and poverty and health disparities. That requires all of us. I don't need to agree with you all the time, but I do need to hold your hand, and we all need to work together toward justice, toward making sure that all families have a roof over their heads and are safe. We can get distracted, and that divide and conquer has worked for centuries. So when we can get together, it's much better. Fall down 7 times, but get up 8. Resilience-driven leadership. Okay. In this case, I guess Beyonce was right. Got to put a ring on it. I know a couple of people on this call who have a couple of rings happening due to recent weddings. And when you have a wedding or a commitment ceremony of some sort, usually the ring, the officiant will say, is a symbol of your continuous love for one another. It continues without ending. And so I want your ring finger to actually be a reminder of continuous learning. One of the things that really helps us in developing resilience and honoring ourselves as leaders is just continuing to learn, continuing to be sort of a student of life. So what's your superpower? It's lifelong learning. For parents, it may be individual growth, and for students, individual growth and learning. For teachers, we call it professional development. For administrators, for systems, that might be organizational effectiveness. But ultimately, learning continuously is important to our ability to cope and thrive. So let's use an example of how we can take our learning and then transition it into teaching. So in this table, there are different ways to teach kids up to age 1, age 3, age 6, age 8, just as an example. And by the way, kids learn prenatally. The research is pretty strong that things that you're feeling. You give off hormones, and kids, and even prenatally, you have an influence on your children. But up to age 1, when things are nonverbal, your actions matter. Can I trust you, to feed me when I'm hungry? There is learning absolutely happening there. Up to age 3, then we transition into toys and how we actually, not necessarily words, but actions with these objects, and learning about and talking about differences and how differences are okay. Brown people and other people, and tall people and short people, and how they can play together. That's wonderful messaging. Up to age 6, using books and videos, and being able to, okay, the questions get interesting up to age 6, right? Why do people have to hold signs to say that Black Lives Matter? Very reasonable question. And sometimes those questions we ourselves have to check if we, the adults, are comfortable answering it. Are we avoiding it because it really is a bigger issue than they can handle developmentally, or are we avoiding it because of our discomfort with answering the question? Up to age 8, questions get more significant, but we can teach in a way that helps kids find common ground, or to navigate concerns they have about going back to school, or will school be, what does it mean when you're quarantined or their friend was quarantined? We can have conversations that are honest and open about race, but also recognizing that similarities are important, differences aren't bad, and how you talk about those kinds of things. So that's just an example of putting our learning into action, and that is by teaching our kids. So here's the ring again. We learn so that we can teach, and guess what? When we teach, we learn more. When we teach, we learn more, and the cycle continues, hopefully forever, but mostly with intentionality. Learn and teach. Okay, finally, our resilience-driven leadership. Put the pinky up. When I was a kid, if you did a pinky swear with somebody, you did this, right? That meant you needed to keep your word. If you broke that pinky swear, you were ostracized, right? It really meant, and it meant something, that you were going to promise to do X, Y, and Z and follow through with it. I think that is an important thing to remember. Let's go back to what we were talking about with regard to social support. Social support correlates with almost every positive outcome you can think of, mental health wise, compliance with medical treatment, every positive outcome. When you have reliable, caring social support, it comes out better. It's a two-way street. Not only supporting others is beneficial, but even giving that support is psychologically and emotionally beneficial. But it's built on a relationship of trust, meaning you should DWI as YWD. You should do what you say you will do, right? To be trustworthy, you need to keep that pinky swear. Even if you're not doing it as an adult, what commitments am I making, and can I be trusted? That's important. Going back to danger and threat with our hand model of the brain, remember the brain is looking out for threat. And if I trusted you and you violated my trust, or you didn't follow through with what you were saying, that is interpreted in our brains as a threat. So trust matters. We want to respond promptly to people and follow through, but remember to pause. We don't want to be impulsive. And for my more introverted friends, it is not introvert or extrovert. We all kind of fall along that continuum. If you fall more along the introverted side of that continuum, you're responding a lot in your head. You're reflecting on it. You're working it out, but you have to make proactive steps to tell people. So you have to be more intentional about telling people about all of the wonderful things that you're planning and working out in your head, right? You have to be more intentional about that than those of us who are more extroverted, who are just going to blurt it out. So just want to emphasize that. Follow through like you promised, or explain why you didn't. Give people the rationale for why something came up and you were unable to do the thing that you said you were going to do. So we need to keep our promises as if they were made to our own very own loved ones. Watch your thoughts, they become your words. Watch your words, they become your actions. Watch your actions, they become your habits. Watch your habits, they become your character. Watch your character, it becomes your destiny. And I would also add your destiny then becomes your legacy. It becomes what you leave behind. So we're going to wrap it up here. We covered the head and we had a couple of tips there. We covered the heart. We had 3 tips there. We had 5 tips related to the hand and doing things as leaders. So you achieved your 10 tips, but you didn't know, right? They were going to be fingertips. They're right at your fingertips. So you have your handout. You don't need a PowerPoint. Your handout for our session tonight is right in your hands. We busted some assumptions and we reimagined ourselves as resilience-driven resilience-driven leaders. We covered the head, which was really about knowledge, the heart, which was about compassion, hands, which are about the courage to act. And we've seen this before. Some of this is new, but some of this is old. So for example, if you're a fan of The Wizard of Oz, these concepts are represented. I do a whole full day leadership thing on just The Wizard of Oz and what this represents in terms of these qualities. They're important to us. It would be fun. Here's your homework assignment. You can revisit The Wizard of Oz and The Wiz, which is actually a very kind of different story, a different Dorothy, but do it through the lens of sort of coping and what we need to cope. And in both of those cases, the lead character never did it alone. Remember social support, they brought people with them. You can even reference Wicked to the sisters. So I want to thank you for your time tonight. I want to invite you to give yourselves a hand, of course, and thank you.
Dr. Hardy-Chandler, thank you so much. This was a lovely presentation. I love the practical tips and I've got all my fingers and I was taking lots of notes. I know that we don't have a ton of time. I'd love to ask one question if I can. Something that stood out to me was welcoming failure as feedback. And as parents, that can be so challenging. We don't want to see our youth fail. Any tips on how, when those failures may happen, how we can have those conversations with our kids to make sure they recognize that we can learn and grow from those failures?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, first of all, rather than even couching them as failures, something didn't go as planned. What did we learn from this? It's an opportunity to identify what are the lessons that we can take forward. We know if it's a project that failed, then we know now we can go in a different direction. What should that different direction be? Where can we identify some strengths out of the situation that seems a little bleak right now? And also the fact that you made it through it, right? And just reinforcing all of the kinds of lessons that could be gleaned from where you can go, not where it didn't happen, if that makes sense.
It makes complete sense. I am so appreciative on behalf of everyone who attended and on behalf of Fairfax County Public Schools. Thank you so much. Just a reminder to our audience that please join us for the last session tomorrow. You can visit actonaddictionnow.org for details and the final registration link. Thank you everyone for your attendance and have a wonderful evening.